Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is that you're watching this, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we start this time, I'm going to start by telling you about something that you may never have heard of, but which affects you every day, particularly if you live in the eastern parts of the United States, and could have a major impact on you within a few decades, and certainly even more than that on your descendants by the end of the century. Which may seem like an awful long way away, but just remember that a child born today in the United States has a good shot at seeing the end of the century. It's called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. It's part of a worldwide system of ocean currents distributing heat around the planet. Now, because the equator receives more solar energy than the poles, heat builds up in the tropics. There is a principle in physics called thermodynamic equilibrium, which essentially means everything wants to be the same temperature as everything around it. I mean, it's why your cup of coffee cools off. It's because the heat energy in the coffee is being distributed to the surrounding cooler air with the idea that eventually the air and the coffee become the same temperature. They have the same heat energy. The same is true of the world at large, just like it is for the coffee on your desk. So the differing levels of heat energy in different parts of the ocean create currents that constantly carry warmer and cooler water on like this giant sort of conveyor belt of currents around and across the oceans. The warmer currents in this graphic are in red. The cooler ones are in blue, which you probably figured out on your own. Warm water is less dense than cooler water, so the warm currents tend to be in shallow water. They're higher in the ocean, where the cooler ones run in deeper water, which is why the currents can seem to cross without affecting each other. The point is, this system of currents has a major influence on both the long term of climate and the short term of weather. It affects wind patterns, it affects how storms form. These currents, in fact, are one of the reasons why hurricanes tend to form closer to Africa and then move across the Atlantic towards North America. That same warm current there also explains why south and southwestern England have mild enough weather that winter snow is rare in London, and you can actually find palm trees in Torquay. That's even though London is about the same latitude as the mouth of the St. Lawrence River between Labrador and Newfoundland. Okay, why do we bring all this up? Well, to see why, let's look a little more locally. Now, because this is an entire worldwide belt, a worldwide system of currents, we could start at any point. But for what's relevant to us at the moment, we'll start in the Caribbean, with warm water being brought up along the southeast United States before moving across the Atlantic towards Great Britain and then up to Greenland. As the water reaches the area around Greenland, by that time it is cooled enough, become dense enough to sink to deeper water, with that deep current being propelled by the force of the water sinking behind it. Now, what keeps the system going is that the tropics continue to receive more solar energy than the poles, so that differential in heat that drives the system still exists. Also, water in polar regions is saltier than that in the tropics because ice is essentially fresh water. So whatever polar oceans are locked up in ice, they can't contain the salt. Saltier water is denser than fresher water, and that difference in density also helps propel the system by helping the cooler water to sink below the warmer water. Now, the relevance of all that will become obvious in just a moment or two. Because the news here is that a new study published in the peer-reviewed science journal Nature Geoscience reports that this current is now moving more slowly than it has in at least 1,600 years. And the belief is that this is directly related to climate change. How? Because a warming climate is going to do two things relevant here. One, because polar regions are warming faster than the tropics, the difference in heat energy between the two regions is shrinking. And that difference is one of the things driving the current. Second, melting polar ice adds fresh water to polar oceans, reducing the salinity, therefore the density, and therefore reducing the density between the poles and the tropics, affecting another driver of the system. A combined effort big enough, and there isn't enough energy to drive that system, and the current breaks down, throwing global climate patterns into disarray, marked by storms and heat waves, along with effects like faster sea level rise along parts of Europe, stronger hurricanes hitting the southeast U.S., and reduced rainfall across the Sahel. Now, those effects can be so wide-ranging, in North America to Europe to Northern Africa, because as years of research have made clear, the Atlantic portion of this world conveyor belt, that AMOC, is the engine that drives the whole system. It moves water at 100 times the rate of the Amazon River. But that circulation has slowed down about 15% since 1950, something this new study calls unprecedented in the last millennium. The specific suspected culprit is melting Arctic ice and the reduced salinity of polar oceans that results. The effects on weather patterns can already be detected. The deeper concern here is that if warming is not halted, that circulation may slow by 34 to 45% by the end of the century, by which time we may have already passed the tipping point, the point beyond which, even if there is no further warming, it's already too late to stop that current from continuing to slow until it stops with catastrophic impacts. Now here it's necessary to note that no, this is not the movie The Day After Tomorrow. If this happened, the results would not be instantaneous, but over the ensuing years and decades, yes, they would be devastating. And realize this is not a new concern. I actually wrote about this possibility, about this concern of this current breaking down 17 years ago. The difference is that then it was a longer-term concern about a serious but still hypothetical possibility. Now we have evidence that it is actually happening, and that we humans, specifically we humans in advanced industrialized societies, that we're the ones to blame. Now, this doesn't mean that things are hopeless, okay? It really doesn't. For one thing, a new report from Ember, a London-based environment think tank, found that in 2020, for the first time, the 27 countries of the European Union produced more electricity from renewable sources like wind, solar, and hydro than from fossil fuels, which actually continues a pattern that's been developing for the last 10 years. What's more, a study from late 2018 found that at that point, generating utility-level electricity through solar and wind was already cheaper than coal and new natural gas plants, and this is without subsidies or any price on carbon. That study from the financial firm Lazard Limited applied a levelized cost of energy, or LCOE analysis, which looks at the cost of power from a given power plant averaged over its entire lifetime. And the study found, again, this was 2 years ago, the study found that the cost of renewables had by then dropped so much that in many areas, building and running new renewables such as solar and wind was already cheaper than just continuing to use existing coal and nuclear plants. In other words, the economics of a clean energy future, they're already there. Then there's the fact that according to the People's Climate Vote, the largest survey of public opinion on climate change and policy options ever conducted, nearly 2/3 of people around the world, including 65% of those in the U.S., think that climate is a global emergency that requires a very serious response. The survey data was gathered from 1.2 million respondents in 50 high, middle, and low-income countries, together encompassing 56% of the world's population. People between the ages of 14 and 18, not surprisingly, expressed the greatest level of concern, with nearly 70% agreeing that this is a climate emergency, but even 58% of those over 60 agreed. And then there is President Joe Biden, who, whatever his faults, still comes into office more concerned about climate change than any previous president. On his first day in office, he canceled the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, the one intended to take tar sands from Alberta to Texas. He's rejoined the Paris Accords. He issued an executive order suspending new oil and gas leases on public lands. He directed federal agencies to purchase electric cars by the thousands and urged Congress to end some fossil fuel subsidies. And he has proposed to eliminate net greenhouse gas emissions from power plants in the U.S. by 2035, while proposing to invest $2 trillion over 4 years to transform to a clean energy economy. Now, I'll note in passing that none of that would have happened had it not been for the supporters of Bernie Sanders who were on that unity task force during the campaign. But the important thing here is that it's happened. And it's certainly doable. Considering that the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine have released a draft version of a report which argues that $2 trillion over 10 years would be enough to build an economy that not only is net zero, but would, quoting the report, also build a more competitive economy, increase high-quality jobs, and help address social injustice in the energy system. Meanwhile, earlier this month, the latest version of the Federal Clean Future Act was introduced in the House of Representatives, an event greeted with applause by environmental groups such as Earth Justice and the NRDC. This latest version of the Act aims to achieve U.S. carbon neutrality by 2050, with an interim goal of reducing pollution by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. And it all sounds really good. It all sounds really does, even allowing for the inevitable political hurdles and the opposition from the fat cats, the corporations, and the corporate-funded interests. Even allowing for all that, that really all sounds very hopeful. And make no mistake, it is. It is very hopeful as far as it goes, which is the problem. It doesn't go far enough. For one thing, Biden's order to suspend new oil and gas leases didn't prevent 31 new leases from being issued during his first month in office. For another, the praise for the Clean Future Act was hardly universal. Groups like Friends of the Earth and Food and Water Watch said the legislation is fundamentally and dangerously lacking. I mean, my own biggest objection to the bill is that it treats fracking as clean energy. But fracking, hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, is designed to increase production of natural gas. The whole point of it is not to move away from fossil fuels, but to enable us to rely on them longer. A climate program that embraces fracking is not serious. As Lucas Ross, program manager at Friends of the Earth, put it, a clean energy standard that qualifies fracked gas is a joke. Meanwhile, Mitch Jones, policy director at Food and Water Watch, called the bill a Green New Dud because, quoting him, it fails to grasp the fundamental truth of fighting climate change. We must stop extracting and burning fossil fuels as soon as possible. We should not waste time creating credit schemes and offset markets or prop up fossil fuels with carbon capture fantasies. And he is absolutely right. We shouldn't do that. We should be stopping as soon as possible. When I was preparing this piece, I kept thinking to myself, you know, if this was a war, we would... But that's actually a silly thought. It's actually a silly thought because this is a war. It is a war that we are waging. It's a war that we are waging on ourselves. A war we're waging on the climate. A war we are waging on the life networks and patterns of this planet and our collective future. On January 27th, science journal Nature published a report saying that analysis of ocean surface temperatures shows that the planet is hotter now than at any time in the preceding 12,000 years. And it may actually be warmer than at any point during the last 125,000 years. Each of the past 4 decades was warmer than the one before. 2020 tied for the hottest year on record, and the last 7 years are the 7 warmest on record. According to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, more than 32,000 species are now threatened with extinction from human impacts like deforestation, pollution, and climate change. 500 of those species could disappear within 20 years. And the dangers are not always direct. One critically endangered species is the North Atlantic right whale, of which fewer than 250 survive, and the greatest danger to them are collisions with boats and drowning from getting entangled in fishing nets. Those deaths are on the increase because climate change is forcing the right whale's main food supply, which is krill, further north into cooler waters, and which draws the whales out of an area where they have some legal protection into areas where they don't. No natural cycle or other BS is going to explain any of that away. It's not enough. What we're doing is it's not enough. Even the grand sounding promises and the solemnly intoned pledges at international conferences are not enough. According to new findings published in December by the United Nations Environment Program, if nations are to meet a central goal of the Paris Agreement of holding the Earth's warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels, those nations will have to roughly triple their current emissions cutting pledges. If they are to keep heating below 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, they would need to increase their targets at least fivefold, to make 5 times the cuts they are now pledging to make. And even despite all the pledges, despite all the current pledges, global greenhouse gas emissions, on average, have risen 1.4% each year over the past decade. They are still going up. The world remains on a trajectory to see the temperature increase of about 3 degrees Celsius or 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, a level that climatologists say would be catastrophic. What we're doing collectively is simply not enough. And I mean the world, particularly the industrialized world, not just the U.S. But if I've seen the time to concentrate in the U.S., well, it's because I have. One reason is because it's us. It's our country. It's the one where we can have the greatest impact. And the U.S. is the world's second largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions, and we have one of the, if not the, most carbon-intensive lifestyle. The carbon footprint of the average American is about 17.6 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year, which is about double the footprint of a person living in the United Kingdom or the European Union, and almost 10 times that of an average citizen of India. So yes, the world needs to do more, and particularly here in the U.S. we need to do more. And damn it, yes, doing more will affect your lifestyle. You might have to live with a little less convenience. You might have to do with a few less high-tech goodies. You might have to take the train instead of flying everywhere. You might have to ride the bus instead of driving. You might have to make a lot of changes, some of them more significant than others. But I'm going to ask you to think back a few decades. If you're as old as me, think back to the 60s, okay? I want you to think back and ask you. Now, I've asked this question before, but I mean it seriously, and I want you to think about it. And again, at this point, I'm not considering issues of how poverty or discrimination or physical limitations might have affected you personally. Just consider how the typical American lived then, the level of technology, the level of convenience available to the average person then at that decade you are imagining, and ask yourself, was that way of living so terrible that you would sacrifice a world to avoid you or your children living that way again? Because right now, yes, we are in a war, and the problem is we're winning. Break time. And we are back, and we're back with some updates on something I talked about last time. Last time I referred to the nearly 200 bills across the legislatures of at least 24 states that have been introduced this year attacking transgender youth by denying them the option of playing scholastic sports or even denying them medical transition care. Vivian Topping, Director of Advocacy and Civic Engagement at the Equality Federation, called it one of the worst legislative sessions I've seen. The first update here is that a number of those bills are advancing. In fact, the one in Mississippi about scholastic sports has passed, and it is heading to the governor for his signature, which he's going to do. More such bills and more such places are coming. And I think what's really so odd here, and even disturbing, is that these bills are so reactionary about rights, even though they are unpopular. In fact, in a number of cases, they are opposed by a majority of goppers in the states where they're being pushed, but they're being pushed anyway. Another update is that, of course, while transgender youth seem to be the particular target of the bigots now, they are not the only ones. All LGBTQ folks are in the crosshairs. At least 36 states have seen what they're called is RFRA type or RFRA style bills introduced since January. Now, RFRA, RFRA, is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's a 1993 federal law saying that government cannot substantially burden religious practices without a compelling interest. Originally designed to protect religious minorities from discrimination, it has been twisted by the right into a weapon against LGBTQ rights. It was, for example, the basis for the Supreme Court ruling that Hobby Lobby could deny its employees contraception coverage. States are now including language modeled on RFRA in bills ostensibly meant to allow churches to operate during the COVID pandemic, but which actually are relying on the now familiar ploy of claiming a religious freedom exemption from respecting civil and human rights, insisting that invoking a god creates a constitutional right to be a bigot. But our third update is that, on the other hand, there is progress. And the reality is that the bigots are fighting a losing battle in what increasingly looks like a last-ditch attempt to legalize their hatred. For one such example of progress, Virginia is about to become the 12th state to ban the so-called gay panic defense in criminal trials. That's the one where someone who's accused of violently attacking an LGBTQ person says the shock of being hit on by that person or discovering that person was gay was just so incredibly severe, such a shock, that they cannot be held responsible for their actions. More significantly, the Equality Act has passed the U.S. House of Representatives. And while with numbskulls like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema around, it doesn't have a good chance in the Senate, it does still have a fighting chance, which just a few years ago would have been unimaginable. All right, we end this time on our recurring feature, 2 Weeks of Stupid, Clowns and Outrages. And we start, as usual, with the clowns. First up, on March 2nd, the state legislature of Idaho rejected a $6 million federal grant designed to improve early childhood education. One clown applauding the decision is Representative Charlie Shepard, who declared that the grant would hurt the family unit. How? Quoting him, "I don't think anybody does a better job in the home than the mother, and any bill that makes it easier or more convenient for mothers to come out of the home and let others raise their children, well, I just don't think that's a good direction for us to be going." Yeah, hey, Shepard, the 1950s called, they want their brain back. But if you want to go full-blown wacko, we have to go to Representative Tammy Nichols, who opposed accepting the grant because, quoting her, "The goal in the long term is to be able to take our children from birth and start indoctrinating them and teaching them to be activists and to do the things that we as parents find inappropriate." Yeah, sure, and the COVID vaccine is really a plot to inject microchips that will implant in your brain. Shepard later apologized on the House floor, saying, "I realize how my remarks sounded derogatory, offensive, and even sexist toward the mothers of this state." Hey, Shepard, no, they did not sound derogatory, offensive, and sexist. They were derogatory, offensive, and sexist. And your refusal to acknowledge that fact means you're just doubling down on being a clown. Or next up, on February 26th, the Oklahoma House of Representatives passed a bill that, according to its supporters, would allow the state legislature to declare federal laws it disagrees with unconstitutional. The bill would let the legislature ask the Attorney General to oppose federal laws in court, and if the AG wouldn't do that, the legislature could just say, well, that law is unconstitutional. Representative Jay Stiegel, a supporter, said, "We're a sovereign state and we have authorities as a state." Yeah, you do, but overruling the federal government is not among them. Didn't people in Oklahoma read the fine print when it became a state? Clowns upon clowns who are only going to enrich some lawyers and saddle the state with hefty legal fees once people stop laughing, that is. All right, finally for this time, our winner clown, and it's an unnamed somebody at Shallow-Water High School in Lubbock County, Texas, who recently decided to have a chivalry day to show, quoting, how the code of chivalry and standards set in the medieval concept of courtly love carries over into the modern day. You can probably guess it didn't go well. Boys and girls are each given a list of rules to follow with points awarded for each rule they demonstrated in practice. Boys were told, for example, to dress in jackets and ties, assist ladies who may have dropped an article by picking it up for them, address women as milady, bow when greeting women, and stand when they enter the room. But if you really want creepy, you got to go to the ladies in the class. The girls were told, dress to please the men, address all men by title. Do not initiate conversations with males. Do not show intellectual superiority. Do not complain or whine. Clean up after the men and obey any reasonable request of a male along with some more. The school quickly had the assignment canceled after parents made the entirely appropriate fuss about it, which only leaves one question. Who the hell ever thought this was a good idea? Whoever it was, definite champion clown material. All right, now for the outrage, and we have sort of 1.5 outrages. Same issue, same person, but 2 different examples. The person is President Joe Biden. The issue is foreign and military policies. First up, on February 25th, on Biden's order, the U.S. dropped 7 500-pound bombs in eastern Syria along the Iraqi border on what is claimed to have been a site housing Iran-backed militias. The attack, which killed 22 people, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, was undertaken without congressional authorization and not in response to any imminent threat. In fact, it was openly labeled retaliation for a rocket attack a week earlier on a U.S. base in northern Iraq, a base which the Iraqi parliament said a full year ago it would like to see closed. To what should have been no one's surprise, this retaliation did not stop and more likely provoked the rocket attack which followed the bombing. This is so far removed from any useful military purpose that military experts quoted by USA Today said it was actually about sending a message that the U.S. was going to remain engaged in the Middle East. But perhaps the worst part of this whole business was when White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said of the bombing, quoting, when threats are posed, he has the right to take an action at the time and in the manner of his choosing, and insisting this was within Biden's titled Article 2 authority. Adopting exactly the same sort of the president can do whatever they want with the military, we don't need no stinking Congress attitude that has plagued our nation with wars on end. On the other hand, our second example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, shows that Joe Biden doesn't always have to show he's tough enough to take action. As a candidate, he promised to make Saudi Arabia, quote, the pariah that they are over the 2018 murder of Saudi writer Jamal Khashoggi. But when it came time to actually do something, he refused to take any action against Saudi Crown Prince and dictator Mohammed bin Salman, even in the face of U.S. intelligence conclusion that bin Salman had ordered Khashoggi's murder. State Department Representative Ned Pierce blew off this moral collapse by calling Saudi Arabia a hugely influential country in that part of the world. Or in other words, what did you expect? Instead, the prince said, the U.S. is recalibrating its relationship with the kingdom, a recalibration that looks like another case of Obama 2.0, tisking and tutting about massive human rights abuses, oppression, imprisonment, torture, kidnapping, and now murder, while doing absolutely nothing so long as a few lessers can be thrown under the bus to maintain appearances. So again, it's about sending a message. It's just that this time the message is, if you're at the top, as long as you sell us oil and buy our weapons, business as usual. The usual outrage. That's it. Let me get out of here. Have the best 2 weeks you can. Wear the damn mask. We'll see you then. Peace.